What's going on, everybody? Mark here with CCO Science of Fishing. I'm here with Captain Chris Wittman from Captains for Clean Water. This is a super special episode for us, guys. It's about to be awesome. We're going to get into everything clean water, Everglades, and how you can do your part to make sure that the water around you is clean and all that.
You've landed on the science of fishing, where passion meets precision. Before we dive in, we would like to thank Bloody Battery, Sea Mule, and Black Reef Co. for sponsoring this episode.
What's going on, Cap? How you doing?
Good to be here. Thank you.
Good to be here.
Doing great.
Good. So, Captains for Clean Water, a lot of people have heard of you guys, but for those that don't know you guys, what do you guys stand for and what do you guys do?
So we are an education and advocacy organization that focuses on trying to advance Everglades restoration and by educating people, getting them to use their voice and then giving them a mechanism to use their voice, we can then influence policy to help advance Everglades restoration projects.
That's awesome. So you guys have had some recent strides and recent wins, right? You guys recently just had some legislation go through on big part of the fishing community.
We did. We've had a lot of success in the last 7.5 years of the organization. In the world of Everglades restoration, a lot of things that were big projects that were kind of the cornerstone projects to Everglades restoration that we were told weren't likely to happen because they were too politically challenging. We've now seen those projects actually under construction and being built. And just last year we had Senate Bill 2508 that was filed that would have jeopardized a lot of the progress that's been made over the last 5-6 years on Everglades restoration. And ultimately the fishing community and the fishing industry mobilized and really led the charge to kill that bill. And that bill ultimately was vetoed by the governor.
Awesome. That's great. So we're making good strides. So what's going on in the Everglades right now that's really, killing our wildlife, it's affecting more than just fish, right? It's affecting the waterfowl, it's affecting everything around.
Yeah,
right?
and the reason that I got involved because it was affecting the fishing, the habitat. But when you really look at Everglades restoration or the need for Everglades restoration, it affects the ecology, it affects our ecosystems, but it affects our economy, real estate values, the hospitality industry, tourism industry. And so when we talk about Everglades restoration, we're really talking about an investment in not only our way of life as anglers, but an investment in our community and in the economy that drives the state of Florida, which is tourism. And people come here for our water. And if we don't have clean water and healthy fisheries, then they're going to go somewhere else.
Right. So you say it affects, the water and everything, but how does it affect? Can you explain a little bit?
So I think to really understand the need for Everglades restoration, you kind of need to go back and look at how we got here. And if you look 100 years ago, the turn of the century, Florida, the southern part of Florida was looked at as worthless swampland. And there was effort, much like the mindset back then was you conquer the land, And so there was a series of efforts to drain the Everglades, to turn what was thought to be worthless swamp into something productive for development where, millions of us live now, but also for agriculture. And there was this process. And in draining the Everglades, basically what happened was the natural system, water would flow from south of Orlando through the Kissimmee River Basin. And as it flowed south and would wind down through the Kissimmee River, it would ultimately make its way into Lake Okeechobee, where Lake Okeechobee would fill up in the wet season, would overflow its southern bank, and would feed into what we call the River of Grass. And kind of that would be like an 80-mile wide river of sawgrass, where that water would very slowly flow and sheet flow across the peninsula all the way down ultimately to Florida Bay. And in doing so, it created balance for the entire system. It balanced salinities in Florida Bay. It hydrated the interior of the Everglades. It's what recharged the drinking water aquifer for the now, over 10 million Floridians in Miami-Dade in the Biscayne Aquifer. And so there was this effort to kind of cut off that flow of water from the lake and then drain the area south of the lake. And ultimately they were successful. And what we're left with is our system that we have today, which is a very man-manipulated, man-controlled system. They dug a series of canals from south of the lake out to bleed the water out to the Atlantic. They connected the St. Lucie River on the east coast and the Caloosahatchee River on the west coast as kind of relief valves to send the water that used to flow down to Florida Bay now out to the east and west coast. And so as a result of that, it threw off the entire balance of the ecosystem. Florida Bay began to get too salty. The interior of the Everglades began to dry up. The drinking water aquifer, Biscayne aquifer, that Miami relies on for drinking water began to dry up and get saltwater intrusion.
Wow.
And the East Coast and the West Coast would get these massive discharges of fresh water to their estuary that was very unnatural. And it would basically turn that estuarian area that should be a mix of saltwater, brackish water into just pure fresh water for months on end, resulting in massive killing of the habitat, the grasses and the oysters. In addition to just the conveyance of putting water in the wrong places at the wrong time and the wrong volumes, those salinity imbalances are what cause the massive seagrass die-offs. And you look at Florida Bay, for example, 2015, they lost almost 50,000 acres of seagrass because it was too salty. So that's a result of just the conveyance. In addition to that, we now are dealing with water from Lake Okeechobee that's extremely polluted from decades of pollution, decades of mismanagement. And so we have this compounding effect of if we get these discharges to the east and west coast, when there is a red tide bloom present, for example, it can fuel that red tide bloom to a very unnatural proportion, both in toxicity and in duration of how long it lasts. And then we get these freshwater toxic algae blooms, blue-green algae or cyanobacteria blooms on Lake Okeechobee that also have been discharged to the coast. And so you just have this really serious compounding effect. What Everglades restoration does is it reconnects that system that was compartmentalized and fragmented so we can return the flow of water south to the Everglades, which reduces the discharges to the east and west coast, will rehydrate the interior of the Everglades, Everglades National Park, and ultimately balance salinities back in Florida Bay. And it's a massive undertaking. It's actually the largest ecosystem restoration project ever undertaken in the world, anywhere on the planet, and it's right here in South Florida.
How many acres are we really roughly dealing with?
You're talking about a whole massive system, but if to put it into perspective, you're looking at 68 infrastructure projects. Okay,
separately,
68 projects that range in what they do, but they all work together to reconnect that flow. So now that we have Lake Okeechobee that has legacy pollution, legacy nutrients in that lake, you also can't just send polluted water to the Everglades. And so the heart of Everglades restoration is called the EAA Reservoir, and it's a massive reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee. At the bottom of the Everglades agricultural area, and it will take Lake Okeechobee's polluted water. It will clean that water through a 6,500 acre man-made wetland, an STA that many of us like to hunt.
Oh yeah.
And it uses aquatic vegetation to clean the nutrients out of the water. And then it will store that water in that deep water reservoir and be able to deliver it to the Everglades during the dry season. So it's kind of mimicking the way the natural system functioned. And cleaning the water in the process. There's other parts that reconnect. It's taking down some of those barriers to flow in the water conservation areas, filling in canals, sections of canals to reestablish sheet flow, pump stations to move the water where it once would naturally go. And so there's all these different components. But, when we started, Everglades restoration was identified that this is a plan that we need to do to fix actions man made 100 years ago. It's like man created the problem, man can fix the problem. So I think it's really important to realize that when we started this wasn't a situation like many environmental issues where it's like you're trying to figure out how to fix the problem. science was there. You know, the
Right.
National Academy of Science peer reviews this. Scientists from all over the world review Everglades restoration on a biannual basis. Science was there, the engineering was there. Here's this plan. And in the year 2000, the year that I started guiding, excuse me, that plan, Everglades restoration, or the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, was voted into law in a bipartisan effort between Governor Jeb Bush and President Bill Clinton. And it was voted into law with a 30-year expected time frame to complete those 68 infrastructure projects. And we thought, okay, by the year 2030, we will have restored the timing and delivery of water to the Everglades. Well, in the year 2016, I had just come back from filming a season of a TV show that I was producing, and I came back and I was calling some of my buddies down in Florida Bay about lining up some shows down there, and there's like, man, we just lost like almost all our seagrass in right outside Flamingo, and so it was kind of like a wake-up call. Well, 2016 happens, we get all these massive discharges to the east and west coast, and it shut down our fishery. And so that was kind of the wake-up call that, one, you have people like myself who were born and raised. I grew up on an island, Sanibel Island. I had at that point in time, a 16-year career as a fishing guide, very impacted by water quality, but I was not involved in any way to use my voice to try to fix it. And it wasn't because I didn't care, and it wasn't because I wasn't impacted or it wasn't important. It was just because there was no way for me that I saw for me to make an impact. There was no organization to plug into that was focused on these issues. There was, and I just felt like this was just this David versus Goliath, this massive problem that how could an individual make an impact or do anything. And so I just hadn't been involved. And unfortunately, that was the mindset of tens of thousands of people that all cared and all saw that there was a problem, but didn't see a way to be involved.
In front of me, I have the Flushmaster by Seamule. This little device simplifies the process for flushing your engines. All it takes is 3 easy steps. Plug the hose into the device, plug the hoses from the device into your motors, and press on. That's all it takes to preserve the longevity of your motors, ensuring 100% clean water is running through them. So if you want to preserve your motors, go to seamule.com and go pick up a Flushmaster. Well, who right now then, who's the Goliath in this situation? Who's really in charge of the water quality and management other than the government?
So, I mean, the water quality and water conveyance is managed by the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District. Okay. But one of the biggest players historically in why kind of our management system had failed and why progress on Everglades restoration had really slowed was because of the industrial sugar industry, big sugar. And it's easy to see, like, what they want for the Everglades agricultural area is a guarantee of water supply and a guarantee of drainage for optimum crop yield. Okay. Right. They're looking out for their interest. However, what that means is treating Lake Okeechobee like a reservoir. Yeah. And if you have a reservoir, you want it as full as possible all the time. And in doing so, that means shutting off meaningful flows to the Everglades, holding water back in the lake, and holding water back in the lake means more damaging discharges to the east and west coast. Right. And so they had been very, very successful in kind of getting water managed by prioritizing their needs. The difference there is economically, the economic impact to the state is much greater when you look at the tourism industry in $120 billion a year industry, or the fishing industry, or any of these other real estate industry. But the big sugar and the sugar industry is a consolidated industry for the most part. It's 2 big companies and then a co-op. Yeah. And so it's very easy for them to align and push legislative pressure to water managers on what desired outcome. When you look at the tourism industry or the fishing industry, we're made up of thousands and thousands of small businesses.
Super fragmented.
Yeah, you look at restaurants, hotels, fishing guides, marinas, boat dealers, boat manufacturers. It's very fragmented. So that was always the challenge of getting all those individual people like myself, people like you, everybody focused and pushing for a common goal to achieve Everglades restoration. And I think that was the missing link. And that's why I wasn't involved. And the more we started talking to people, we realized there's thousands of people that care about this, tens of thousands, millions of people that care about the Everglades. But they just weren't involved because there was this void of a mechanism to, one, educate them on why this was happening, that there is a solution, and then to be able to keep them up to date on opportunities for them to use their voice or threats against those solutions. And so that's really why Captains for Clean Water exists. That's why we started the organization. It wasn't to start a movement. It was to give organization to a movement for clean water, and to educate people so that they were willing and able to use their voice when their voice was needed.
I gotcha. So the sugar industry has a big hand in this. Well,
They do.
I have a follow-up question. Kind of, you say they want it as full as possible and they take in all that water, but don't they treat their crops with pesticides, and then do they release that back into the lake?
So the sugar industry, is one of the largest political influencers
Pissing off some
in
people right
in
now,
the
aren't
state
we?
of Florida. Yeah, but I mean, look, it's just reality. It's not demonizing sugar.
Right.
They're trying to look out for what is absolute best for their business, but in doing so, it's done from such a level of heightened, I don't know if it's greed or what, but the sugar industry, for example, hasn't suffered a crop loss due to a water shortage since the 80s.
Whoa.
You look at the coastal communities being devastated every few years from these discharges. Yeah. It's not like Everglades restoration doesn't put the sugar industry out of business. It's just they want this over and above guarantee for water supply, even though that guarantee means nobody else getting the same guarantee.
Are they going to suffer if they don't have as much water?
No, I mean, like I said, they haven't suffered from water shortage since the 80s, but they want that guarantee of more water than they actually need. They want it there in case. Well, that you're looking at an archaic industry that isn't this massive job supplier, isn't this feeding America's families. I mean, we're growing sugar, to be honest with you. So it's not like it's this integral food crop. But regardless of all that, Everglades, we can send water south to the Everglades and reduce those discharges without hurting their business. They just want that guarantee, and they've been accustomed to that guarantee and don't want to let it go. And so, when you look at the pollution part of it, for decades, yes, the sugar industry would, when rain would fall on the EAA, south of Lake Okeechobee, and those fields would become flooded, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres, they would back pump that water into Lake Okeechobee. Yeah. With that back pumping came the pollution, not only the pesticides, but the nitrogen and phosphorus synthetic fertilizers. That is what a lot of the legacy pollution in the lake today is a result of.
Does it keep breeding?
Well, no, but it's there. And the other is we have massive inflows from the northern part of the lake into the lake where it naturally does flow, but they're not meeting the TMDLs, the total daily maximum loads of phosphorus coming into the lake. And so the reality there is, yes, everybody says, oh, the problem is, septic tanks in Orlando. And yes, everybody has an impact. Everybody has a footprint. But, what's not realized is the majority of the watershed north of Lake Okeechobee, the majority of it is primarily industrial agriculture. Yeah. It's not just septic tanks in Orlando that are the problem.
Right.
It's all these problems. And so what you have now is Lake Okeechobee is so polluted that you can't clean it when it's being dumped out the rivers to where I live in the East Coast in Stewart. So you can clean it when you're sending it south. You bring it into that reservoir, you clean it through those filter marshes, and you send that clean water south to the Everglades. And so what happened, the change there was a federal judge issued a consent decree that said you cannot send polluted water into a national park. And so where the sugar industry used to be able to drain their fields south and let that water flow south, it was resulting in pollution going into the park. And we still see the remnants of that today with the elevated mercury levels in fur-bearing animals and some of the game fish and food fish that people fish for, especially in the tribal communities down in the kind of southern part of the Everglades there. That is a result of a byproduct of methylmercury being a byproduct of the binding with sulfur from synthetic fertilizers. So federal judge said you can't send polluted water into a national park. There was a deal made, and so the government, instead of the sugar industry having to take portions of their land and build filter marshes themselves, they sold some of that land to the government. The government then constructed STAs, man-made wetlands, and today the taxpayers foot the main bill to clean up their pollution before it's sent to the Everglades. You know what? It doesn't really seem right to me that we're covering the lion's share of that cost, but
it should be sugar industry.
It should be
the agricultural industry.
It should be, but at the same time, it's also we absolutely do not want to send polluted water to the Everglades.
Yeah,
and so it's kind of a bittersweet thing there. But the reality of it is, with the sugar industry, they're one of the biggest political donors in the state, depending on the year. You're talking about a couple of companies that can put tens of millions of dollars into the political system, have dozens of lobbyists on retainer, up 70 plus lobbyists on retainer in Tallahassee every year, and more than that in Washington D.C. And you're talking about also a federally subsidized industry. And so that's kind of the crazy thing is, through the Farm Bill, the sugar industry is subsidized with taxpayer dollars that actually turn into profit for them. And so it's done in a couple ways, but one is there's tariffs on import sugar. And so the cost of sugar in the United States is double that of the normal world market,
really?
Which means that people who use sugar here, if there's sugar grown in the Dominican Republic, there's a tariff that brings up the cost. So it artificially inflates the value of their product. It'd be like if we artificially subsidized fishing charters and they were $3,000 instead of $1,500.
Yeah.
It's bringing a floor up. The other part of it is that there's an incentive, and it was created so that food farmers wouldn't go out of business when the market did not demand enough of their supply to keep them in business, right?
Yeah.
So the result is now there's this incentive to simply produce as much sugar as possible, because whatever the market doesn't consume, the government will pay them for the balance. So
Really?
It comes back to wanting this water guarantee, and the water guarantee isn't to stay in business. It's just to get a little bit more crop yield. You might be talking about, look, we take 30% more water, it gets us 5% more yield. But that 5% yield, that's the incentive that's created through that subsidy program.
Yeah.
And so there's really zero desire from Big Sugar to come to the table, because they've got a federally subsidized crop that's basically corporate welfare.
Yeah.
That's benefiting from taxpayer dollars, and they can turn around and influence politics to have water managed in their favor. And so it wasn't until the public in masses started creating enough pressure and being vocal enough and being educated and engaging on this issue that the tide changed on how Everglades restoration was progressing.
Right. That's incredible. That's just like, I didn't know all that. I didn't know how it's cyclical almost, where they're getting money to then pump it back to get more money, and it's just they're printing dollars.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's I think that's something that in the big picture that's why there's this reluctancy. A lot of people say, why don't we just get everybody to come to the table? And it's like, well, we're all being hit with a baseball bat every couple of years, and they're not. And so there's just no, there's no shared adversity. Now, what has happened in the last 7 years, when we started Captains for Clean Water, of those 68 infrastructure projects, we're halfway through the projected timeline now, right? You've got 30-year time frame. It's the year 2016. We're past that halfway point. Not a single one of those 68 projects was completed.
Not one.
Not one was completed. So Everglades restoration was falling way behind track, way off schedule.
Yeah.
The way that it was falling off track is it just wasn't receiving ample funding year to year to fund the Army Corps from Washington, D.C., to fund the Water Management District from the state, to build those projects.
Right.
And so if there wasn't the money to build them, there wasn't the money to award the contracts, it simply wasn't happening fast enough. And now that the public has really shined a spotlight on Everglades restoration and why it's this investment in our economy, now we are seeing record funding. For several years now, year after year, we've received record funding both out of the state of Florida and out of the federal government in a bipartisan effort. We've seen record funding under Governor DeSantis' administration out of the state, more funding than we've ever seen before in the history of Everglades restoration. We've seen record funding out of Washington, D.C. under both President Trump and President Biden. And so we're seeing bipartisan support for Everglades restoration. And it's no wonder why. I mean, it's a nonpartisan issue. It's clean water. We all need clean water, whether it's to recreate on or to drink.
Right.
We need it. And so Everglades restoration, because of the public getting involved and using their voice and really shining a light on this, is the most important thing to our community that we can control, right? My hometown got decimated by Hurricane Ian last year.
Yeah.
We can't control hurricanes. We can control how we manage our water.
Yeah.
And so that's the message that people are delivering to policymakers, and that message is being heard. And today we've seen massive progress. Today, as we sit here 7.5 years after that 2016 water event, over 50 of those projects have either been completed, hit a major milestone, or begun construction.
Wow.
So there's progress being made, and there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, that's incredible. So now we're like more than halfway done with these projects and bringing back water.
Yeah, now we see that, like, if we continue to maintain the funding needed for those agencies charged with building Everglades restoration projects, progress can be made and we can restore the Everglades. But that threat of funding stalling or stopping or being diluted or policies being put in place to handcuff water managers, those threats will exist and will continue to happen as long as Big Sugar is influencing politics. Right. And they're not going anywhere. They do that, and they do it on both sides of the aisle. When Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, there was one of the brothers from Florida Crystals was hosting fundraisers for Hillary Clinton the same night that the other brother at Florida Crystals was hosting fundraisers for Trump. Wow. So this isn't a one side. They play both sides, and they understand that. And the reality is, our individual stakeholders can't go dollar for dollar. This is David versus Goliath battle. And so the power that the people have is their voice, and the unified voice, collective voice of individuals is what creates enough public pressure to create political will.
For those of you that don't know what this right here is a turtle box. A turtle box is a marine grade speaker. It's the best one on the market, y'all. If you guys want to go get one, check the link in the description. I always use it anytime I'm out there on the water, whether I'm at the beach, whether I'm fishing, wherever I am, this always comes with me. I love listening to the music, and the sound quality and audio is the best out there. Forget all the other brands. You need a turtle box.
So in terms of sending water down south, How does that affect places like Miami and Homestead and all that? Because technically Miami's supposed to be underwater, right?
Right.
So,
So
what's going to happen with that?
great question. So one of the myths around Everglades restoration is that it'll flood Miami,
Yeah.
or it'll flood the communities south of the lake, South Bay and Belglade and Clewiston. That's not true. Everglades restoration is designed. It's not. We're not going back to just this free flowing thing. We're mimicking and returning the timing and delivery of water. And so, for example, just today before I came to do this podcast, I was at a ribbon cutting for a pump station that will deliver clean, fresh water to Biscayne Bay. And much like Florida Bay, suffering from hypersaline conditions in the drier years, in the hotter months, Biscayne Bay has the same issue in certain areas. And so a pump station just went online, was completed, that will take some of that water that flows south through Everglades restoration and be able to deliver it to Biscayne Bay.
Wow.
And so there's major ecological benefits in returning. Look, Mother Nature gets it right, and the water was supposed to flow south. We just need to be able to restore that capability.
We were messing with it, right? We had
Exactly.
didn't we have like seeds get dispersed through the Everglades? I forget what
One of the things
millions,
they
right?
did was they were dropping Melaleuca seeds from airplanes, because the Melaleuca tree takes up a tremendous amount of water. And so, there was all these really different angles of how we dry up this area.
Right.
We see now 100 years later that things that were done with good intentions are having devastating impacts and devastating effects. And I think that is a lesson that's important for us to keep in mind when we look at Everglades restoration, because the key word there is restoration, meaning restore. And there are projects that are proposed, a lot of times supported by the sugar industry, to slow the flow of water into Lake Okeechobee. Okay. Well, yes, the water coming into the lake needs to be slowed down. It needs to be cleaned. Right. There was a Kissimmee River restoration project that returned the curvature and oxbows and floodplain to a section of the Kissimmee River that was channelized and straightened. It had major benefits right off the bat when you talk about the migratory bird and waterfowl populations. But more needs to be done. But one of the proposed things was to take the water and drill wells and inject Lake Okeechobee's polluted water into the boulder zone. Just throw it away down 3,000 feet underground, or to inject it into the aquifer storage and recovery, or ASR wells. Well, if you look at that, one, throwing that water away or putting that water into the aquifer those projects are expensive. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. But that doesn't do anything for Florida Bay, right? If the water's thrown away into the boulder zone, it doesn't do anything for Florida Bay or the Biscayne aquifer or anything else. And the other part of that, you talk about injecting the water into the drinking water aquifer and then sucking it back out when it's needed. Well, that's a thought that's done with good intention, but so was draining the Everglades.
Yeah.
So it's like, we don't want to be 50 years from now and go, oh, we've polluted our drinking water aquifer now because we did this, and we thought we'd be able to suck it back out, but we weren't. Like, we need to look at holistic solutions that as closely mimic Mother Nature as possible. And injecting the water into the aquifer does not mimic Mother Nature.
Yeah.
Creating surface water storage, water conservation areas, stormwater treatment areas, that can closely mimic nature. And a lot of times it is also useful to nature, like we see with the STAs and the migratory birds utilizing those cleaning marshes. So to me, it's like we need to be real careful that we're not doing things that we think are this faster solution that can have very long-term negative impacts.
Yeah.
And I think we're in a very good place with science really leading the effort in Everglades restoration.
I gotcha. So it has to be a concerted effort, not only from fishermen and women and hunters, but just everybody. This affects everybody. The water in the Everglades and in Okeechobee.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and people need to understand, we talk about Everglades restoration, we're restoring the pathway and flow of water into the Everglades.
It affects the whole state.
But what we're talking about is you don't have to live in the Everglades or recreate in the Everglades to be impacted by it. Stewart, Fort Myers, Sanibel, Boca Grande, Naples, the Keys, Florida Bay, all those areas benefit from Everglades, or Lake Okeechobee itself. Those areas all benefit from Everglades restoration, and you don't have to be an angler or a hunter to benefit from it.
Yeah.
We talk about property values. If you own a home, especially a waterfront home, there was real estate deals that fell apart in those water crisis years, 2018, 2016, 2013, costing hundreds of millions of dollars. The hospitality industry that, many of our friends and family work in, hotels, restaurants, bars, travel, tourism, or just your way of life. People who retire to Florida because they love its waters and they want to share our beaches and our waterways with their grandchildren.
Right.
In one way or another, water quality impacts every single one of us that live here in Florida or that hope to visit Florida. We get people from all over the world that want to come experience the Everglades. We get people from all over the world that fishing in the Everglades for tarpon or snook is on their bucket list, and it's this world-class fishery. So really all of us have a stake in Everglades restoration, which is why it's important for people outside of Florida to also advocate to fund Everglades restoration, because we need those federal dollars. It's a 50-50 partnership between the state of Florida and the federal government to restore the Everglades. And those agencies building those projects need that funding year after year through completion.
It's not just a Florida problem.
It's not a Florida problem.
It's a national problem.
Yep. You look at the marine industry, for example.
Yep.
You look at what percentage of sales of boat motors happening in Florida, and you've got Mercury, Yamaha, Suzuki is now in Florida, but you've got companies like that, marine manufacturers. You look at companies like Yeti Coolers out of Texas, or apparel, Columbia, Orvist, AFCO, Sims, all these different companies that aren't in Florida that have a major stake in Florida's water quality.
We're one of their main markets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's incredible. So in terms of you seeing how things have changed over time, being a fisherman and a former guide yourself, how have you seen the fishery improve over time?
I've seen the fishery decline over time.
Why? Why do you think?
Through the impacts to habitat. I have seen, I can remember even when I was a kid hearing stories of the good old days and how it used to be and how this area used to be all grass or this water was crystal clear, and still having what I thought were phenomenal days fishing, right? And I'm going like, what do you mean it's great? Well, it was great to me without that historical knowledge. And I think that's one of the important things that the fishing community needs to do, is to educate the new people coming in, because somebody who just moved here last year may go out fishing today and think that they had this stellar day and think that this is great. But somebody like myself who's been here for 46 years is going to go, this isn't anything like it was. And so that baseline of what a good day is or what a productive fishery is constantly shifting downward.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So you look at some of the areas that I used to fish as a kid around the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River.
Sure.
That was long, lush turtle grass, really healthy oyster bars, just a labyrinth of oyster bars. And I would catch permit inshore in Southwest Florida in those flats, along with the obvious species, snook and redfish and trout and tarpon, cobia. Those oyster bars and grass flats that I fished as a kid do not exist today.
At all?
They're gone. Wow. The oyster bars are remnants of their shells. The seagrass is gone. And it's a result of those discharges.
Is anything living there
Okeechobee
anymore? Is it getting visited by any fish?
replaced. It gets replaced by macroalgae and different things like that.
Yeah.
And it's a cycle. With every time you have that ecosystem impact or habitat loss, the impact goes farther and farther out. The other impact you have is the pressure on the fishery. So if you have 20% of a fishery that you lose its habitat, okay, well, you had 100% of anglers spread over 100% of area. Take 20% of it away. Now you have 100% of the anglers in 80% of the area. So the area that's not affected is now affected by increased pressure.
Yeah.
And that is a domino effect that just trends downward. What we have seen is if we can put these ecosystems back into sustained periods of recovery instead of sustained periods of decline, that Mother Nature will heal itself. It can recover.
So we can bring it all back.
We can bring it back. We saw it with Kissimmee River restoration. The migratory birds and waterfowl that used to use that floodplain historically returned the very next wet season. We've seen it in Florida Bay, where once we are seeing more adequate amounts of fresh water pushed into the bay, the seagrass is starting to come back. But if you get a year or two period of recovery and those seagrasses start to come back, and then they're just hit with another water quality issue, they can't sustain that. You have to have durations longer than the recovery. You're talking about 10 years of recovery. Yeah. You can't have a hit to that every 3 years. And so Mother Nature can rebound if we give it the ability to rebound.
Right.
You know, back to the kind of some of the misnomers of Everglades restoration will flood this area out or do these things. One of the areas that was of concern that's near here is Las Palmas. It's the 8.5 square mile area. And it was an area, a community that was built outside of the Everglades protection barrier. And so basically along Miami, there's a barrier, a berm, and a canal that separates the Everglades from current day Miami and keeps the water in the Everglades and out of Miami. Yeah. Well, this community, 8.5 square miles, was built outside that protection levee. And so the concern was, okay, you bring water tables back up like they naturally were in the southern Everglades, it'll flood out this community. So what the state did was they looked at, okay, this would be a massive undertaking with years of litigation tied up in the courts if you were to do a buyout program or go in and eminent domain those communities. Yeah. What they came up with was to build a curtain wall. And they basically brought in this thing that looks like a massive chainsaw that trenches down 60 foot deep. And they put a membrane and basically pour a wall, concrete wall underground that stops that groundwater from flowing and flooding that community. And so that project is done. It was completed in a year. Wow. And today they now, because of that project, have the ability to push more water under the bridges of Tamiami Trail that have been recently completed. So we're getting more and more of these projects online that enable us to send that water south and convey it south like Mother Nature had it, and do it in a manner that doesn't negatively impact our communities.
That's great. So our fisheries hopefully will eventually come back if we keep this concerted effort to keep going. Yep. So you being a guide back in the day, you know, you've seen the changes, you've seen all that. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what it used to be like? You know, what were some of the, do you have any great stories from back then?
I mean, look, let me put it to you this way. When I used to go out into Southwest Florida as a kid, I didn't know jack about what I know now, right? First of all, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have these ways of getting information and how-tos. I mean, you would read stuff in a magazine or a book. But we were throwing, fiberglass spinning rods with monofilament with, a bass assassin out of an aluminum boat that was loud as can be and catching giant snook and tarpon and permit. The fact that what we were able to, how good that fishery was with the tools that we had, we didn't have like the technology with bottom finders and electronics that we had. We didn't have the technology with the actual equipment like braided line and fluorocarbon, and we didn't have any of that, yet we were able to, it was just so good and fish were so abundant that even with crappy gear, we could go have a successful day.
Catch world-class fish.
Yeah, it was amazing. And you don't realize it at the time when you're, 10 years old out there catching, 40-inch snook. But looking back on it, it's like, man, that was kind of a common occurrence back there. And now, even with all these things, with these boat hauls that are ultra quiet and trolling motors that are ultra quiet and, braided line, you can cast 5 times farther than you could, 12-pound mono. The days that we catch those trophy fish are fewer and farther between. Right. And so It's kind of that shifting baseline down. And to me, the hope is, I recently had a kid, he'll be 2 years old this November.
Awesome.
But my hope is that he gets to experience some of the things that I got to experience. Yeah. And if that means, it's impossible to predict what recovery looks like, right? It either is we keep it from getting any worse, or it gets better.
Right.
And so it's my hope that, he 20 years from now, when we're talking about this stuff, that he still has the ability to go experience the things that we've been able to experience. And,
right.
And the reality is, we've got to remain laser focused on pushing Everglades restoration through to completion, because the threats and political influence from the sugar industry to slow that progress will remain.
Yeah, of course.
And so, if people get complacent when we have years of good water quality, that complacency can lead to a lack of people using their voices, and we can backpedal. In the year 2000, when the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was voted into law with this bipartisan effort, people popped champagne bottles and said, we're going to save the Everglades. This is amazing.
Over 20 years later now.
20 years later now, those, they didn't realize, like, they thought they were there, and it stalled and didn't go anywhere. And so
right.
That's up to us. That's where the people listening to this podcast come in, is we cannot get complacent. We must stay engaged. We cannot get issue fatigue and think like, we've been pushing for this for 7 years and it's never going to. It is happening.
Yeah.
We just have to make sure that it continues to happen.
Slowly.
And that means, I mean, look, it took 100 years to get in this position.
Right.
It's the largest restoration project on the planet. We're not going to fix it overnight.
Yeah.
That means we have to keep our voices and people engaged for years and years and years to come. And understanding that is the basis of staying engaged.
Right.
And if the more you know about it and the more you understand Everglades restoration, the more likely you are to stay involved in the good times and the bad.
So what can someone that, listening to this podcast that wants to keep their water clean, that wants to make sure that the South Florida in general, the country is taken care of, what can an individual do on their own singular basis?
So first of all, realize that for years, the missing link that resulted in Everglades restoration stalling was individual voices. That's the most important thing. So do not underestimate how critically important it is for the individuals to be involved in this. The second part of that is to understand it. You're much more likely to participate in something if you're knowledgeable about it. And Everglades restoration is no different. Look, you're much more likely to participate in, betting on the football season if you understand football and the teams involved and the players involved. Well, you're much more likely to stay involved in Everglades restoration if you understand it. And so educate yourself by listening to podcasts like this, by going to our website, captainsforcleanwater.org. There's a tremendous amount of information on there that we put together in multiple formats, depending on how you like to receive your information. We do it with videos, we do it with blogs, written content. We do it in podcast interviews like this. So being educated and then getting involved in having a mechanism for us to inform you of opportunities. We need you to use your voice. Support funding for Everglades restoration, or threats. Help us kill Senate Bill 2508. Add your name to that list. Sign up for our email list. It doesn't cost anything. You can become a member if you like, but you don't have to. You don't have to spend money with us. You can just sign up, add your name to where we can get a hold of you with education and with threats and with opportunities. You can go into help spread awareness. Awareness part. If you've seen the movement for water and kind of the movement around Captains for Clean Water over the last 7+ years. Awareness is a big part of it, right? It's wearing the hat. It's wearing a shirt. But I would say that you go on our website and you buy a Captains for Clean Water hat, it comes with a responsibility. If you show up at an event that we're speaking at and we're giving out hats, it comes with a responsibility. Don't put that hat on and then don't do your part to understand Everglades restoration. Because if somebody comes up to you, the idea with the hat is, it's an awareness piece. Somebody comes up and you says, hey, what's that hat about? Captains for Clean Water. If you just say, oh, well, it's a hat I got at a thing where some fishing guides were talking about some stuff, don't bother wearing the hat.
That's not what we need.
What we need is that hat should be a catalyst to open a conversation for you to then to educate that person and bring them into this effort with you. And so that is what we need people to do, is educate themselves, be involved, be able to be connected to, be willing to mobilize. You know, we had Senate Bill 2508, hundreds of fishing guides canceled their charters. Business owners walked away from their businesses to drive to Tallahassee to testify for 3 minutes apiece about that bill. Tens of thousands of people took action and sent emails and made calls to their elected officials over a 55-day campaign. You have to be willing to take action when the need for action is there. And so it's all those longer-term components of educating yourself and educating others, and like we are doing today, and then the shorter term components, which are take action when action is needed. And we'll let you know when that time is.
Absolutely. So guys, you heard it here. You guys got to get involved with Captains for Clean Water if you want your fisheries, if you want your drinking water, if you just want a better way of life. Stay informed. Check them out. Check out Captain Chris here. Captains for Clean Water, you guys. I implore you to please go and contribute to the cause. Thank you, Cap. Thanks for coming
Thank
today.
you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on the Science of Fishing. We hope that this episode was helpful and you learned something for the next time you're wetting a line. Before we cast off, a special thanks to our sponsors, Bloody Battery, Sea Mule and Black Reef Company. Stay hooked by following us on social media at Science of Fishing and hitting the subscribe button. And if you know someone who'd enjoy this, please share it with them. Until we meet again, catch 'em up.